He pretended she didn't exist. The ballroom of the Whitmore Grand Hotel shimmered under crystal chandeliers worth more than most homes in America, each prism scattering warm light across marble floors polished to a mirror shine. And Evelyn Harper stood just inside the entrance, as if she had stepped into someone else's memory rather than a public legacy announcement. At exactly 6 feet away, Daniel Brooks laughed too loudly at something his new wife whispered, his hand resting at the small of her back in a gesture carefully angled toward the cameras. And when his eyes passed over Evelyn, they did not stop, did not flicker, did not acknowledge that she had once shared his last name for 8 years. The string quartet near the east wall played something soft and expensive, the kind of music meant to float rather than land, and waiters in white jackets moved through the crowd offering champagne that cost more per bottle than Evelyn used to spend on groceries in a week. Yet she declined with a small shake of her head, her gloved fingers steady, her breathing even. Conversations shifted in subtle waves around her, whispers carried beneath perfume and polished cologne. Is that her? I thought she moved away. Didn't he leave her? And somewhere near the center of the room, Daniel lifted his glass to thank the board members of Whitmore Enterprises for believing in the future, a future he spoke of as if he owned it. Evelyn watched him from a distance measured not just in feet, but in years, remembering the apartment they once rented 30 miles outside the city when ambition was still a shared dream instead of a private ladder. Remembering late nights at a kitchen table stacked with financial reports that did not yet belong to him. Tonight, Daniel wore a tuxedo tailored within an inch of perfection, cufflinks engraved with the Whitmore crest, and confidence sharpened by inheritance rumors that had circled since Charles Whitmore's passing 3 weeks ago. What Daniel did not know, what no one in this room seemed to suspect, was that Evelyn had received her own letter, delivered by certified mail to a quiet townhouse 2 states away. A letter she had read once, and then folded carefully back into its envelope without a single tear. Across the ballroom, Daniel's new wife offered Evelyn a polite smile that never reached her eyes, the kind reserved for strangers who do not matter, and Daniel followed that smile with deliberate indifference, turning his body slightly as if Evelyn were simply part of the decor. But Evelyn did not flinch, did not retreat toward the exit framed by gold-trimmed doors, because she had not come to be seen by him. She had come because at precisely 8:30 p.m., according to the engraved invitation, the Whitmore estate would formally address succession, and time, unlike people, never ignored her. She removed her gloves slowly, folding them into her clutch, revealing hands that had once signed contracts Daniel never bothered to read. And as the grandfather clock near the staircase began to chime the half-hour, the murmur of the crowd softened, attention shifting toward the small stage where a mahogany podium waited beneath the crest of an empire built over 4 decades. Daniel straightened his jacket, confidence settling on his shoulders like a crown he believed already his, and Evelyn lifted her chin, just slightly, not in defiance, not in pride, but in quiet recognition that some moments do not need applause to change everything. The chime of the grandfather clock faded into a hush so complete that even the clink of crystal against crystal seemed too loud for the room, and Daniel stepped slightly closer to the stage, as if proximity alone could secure what he believed was already his, while Evelyn remained where she was, neither front nor back, simply present, her gaze steady on the polished mahogany podium, where a silver microphone caught the light. The attorney, a tall man in a charcoal suit with wire-rimmed glasses, adjusted a leather folder embossed with the Whitmore crest, and the quiet authority in his posture shifted the air more effectively than any announcement could. Daniel's new wife leaned toward him, her whisper brief and bright, and Daniel answered with a confident nod, the kind meant to reassure cameras that were not officially there but always present in rooms like this. Evelyn felt the weight of observation brush against her shoulders again, the subtle glances measuring her dress, her composure, her right to stand among them. And she remembered another room years ago, much smaller, where Charles Whitmore had sat across from her at a plain oak desk, sleeves rolled to his forearms, asking questions no one else thought to ask. She had not been his family, not by blood, not by marriage, but she had been the one who stayed late reviewing projections when the market dipped 12% in a single quarter, the one who suggested diversification into renewable energy when the board resisted, The one who understood that legacy was built in quiet decisions made on ordinary Tuesdays. Daniel had once sat beside her in those early meetings, impatient, checking his phone under the table, waiting for something larger, something louder, when the attorney cleared his throat. The sound was gentle yet commanding, and the low murmur of executives and investors dissolved into attentive silence. Evelyn's pulse did not quicken, not because she did not care, but because she had already lived through the moment that mattered most 3 weeks earlier when a sealed envelope arrived at her townhouse in Connecticut, its return address engraved in understated black ink. She had opened it at her kitchen counter where morning light spilled across unpaid utility bills and a single mug of black coffee, and she had read every line without interruption, without disbelief, only with a quiet recognition that some promises are kept without witnesses. Across the ballroom, Daniel clasped his hands in front of him, chin lifted, confidence resting easily on his shoulders, unaware that the future he imagined was already written in ink that did not include him. The attorney began to speak about vision, stewardship, continuity, words that floated through the chandeliers and settled over the crowd like fine dust, and Evelyn exhaled slowly, folding her hands at her waist, feeling neither triumph nor resentment, only the steady calm of someone who had long ago stopped asking to be chosen and had instead chosen to endure. The attorney's voice carried evenly across the ballroom, measured and deliberate, as though each word had been weighed before it was allowed to exist, and Daniel listened with the polite patience of a man waiting for his own name to complete the sentence. Phrases about stewardship, responsibility, and enduring vision filled the air, and the executives closest to the stage nodded, as if they were already rehearsing their congratulations. Evelyn stood still, the soft fabric of her dress brushing against her ankles, her posture neither rigid nor relaxed, simply grounded, and she noticed the way Daniel subtly shifted his stance forward, placing himself within clear view of the podium, as though history favored proximity. She remembered another night, almost 4 years ago, when Charles Whitmore had called her into his private office long after the rest of the staff had left, the city skyline glowing beyond floor-to-ceiling windows, and he had asked her what she would protect first if everything else fell apart. She had not answered with profits or expansion or headlines, but with people, with stability, with the quiet dignity of employees who relied on steady paychecks to keep lights on and mortgages current. Charles had studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, not impressed but assured. Daniel had not been there that night. He had been at a networking dinner downtown, chasing introductions that sounded more impressive than they were. The attorney adjusted his glasses and began referencing specific clauses, the formal language weaving through the silence like thread through silk, and a few members of the board exchanged confident glances, already calculating their future positions. Daniel's new wife leaned closer to him. Again, her smile controlled, her confidence borrowed from his, and Evelyn felt the faint brush of memory at her fingertips, recalling the day Daniel packed his belongings into cardboard boxes, promising that ambition required sacrifice, promising that she would understand someday. She had understood more than he realized. She had understood that he was choosing visibility over integrity, applause over patience. The attorney turned a page, the faint sound of paper echoing louder than expected, and the room seemed to contract around that simple motion. Daniel straightened his shoulders, his expression composed into something almost ceremonial, and Evelyn lowered her gaze briefly to her bare hands, remembering the signature she had placed on a document in Charles Whitmore's office just weeks before his health declined, a document that had not felt like a reward but like a responsibility. When she looked up again, her eyes were clear, not searching the crowd for validation, not seeking Daniel's reaction, but fixed calmly on the man at the podium, because she knew that in a matter of seconds the room would learn what she had already accepted alone at her kitchen counter in the quiet light of morning. The attorney paused just long enough for anticipation to sharpen, and in that suspended breath the ballroom seemed to lean forward as one, the chandeliers humming faintly above as though even the light was waiting. Daniel's fingers tightened around the stem of his glass, not from doubt but from expectation, and a subtle smile formed at the corner of his mouth, rehearsed and ready. Evelyn remained motionless, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze steady, As the attorney spoke of loyalty demonstrated not in headlines, but in hours unseen, of counsel offered without self-interest, of a partnership defined by discretion rather than display, a ripple of polite confusion moved through the crowd. Small glances exchanged between board members who had assumed they understood the shape of this evening. Daniel's smile faltered almost imperceptibly, replaced by concentration, as though the wording required interpretation. Evelyn heard her own heartbeat, not racing, simply present, echoing the memory of the morning she had unfolded that letter at her kitchen counter, the paper heavy in her hands, the ink deliberate and unmistakable. The attorney lifted his eyes from the page and let them travel across the room before continuing, his tone unwavering as he referenced a final amendment signed and notarized in the final week of Charles Whitmore's life, an amendment executed in full clarity of mind. A murmur spread again, this time edged with uncertainty, and Daniel shifted his weight, his confidence no longer ceremonial but searching. Evelyn thought of the hospital corridor where she had once sat beside Charles as winter sunlight filtered through narrow windows. His voice thinner yet resolute when he had spoken about legacy not as ownership but as guardianship, about choosing someone who would protect what could not be measured on quarterly reports. She had not asked for anything that day, had not expected anything, and when she left his bedside, she believed the conversation would remain only that, a conversation. The attorney's next sentence fell into the silence with deliberate clarity, stating that all controlling shares of Whitmore Enterprises, along with the full authority attached to them, were to pass to one individual designated as sole heir and steward of the empire. Daniel's posture stiffened, his expression fixed as if waiting for his name to confirm the future he had already envisioned. A glass somewhere near the back of the room touched a table a little too hard, the sound sharper than intended. Evelyn did not look at Daniel, did not seek his reaction, because she had already faced the truth alone weeks ago. The attorney drew a measured breath and spoke the name written in ink that could not be revised. And as it traveled across the ballroom, it seemed to slow time itself. Every whisper cut short, every expectation halted, until the weight of it settled unmistakably on Evelyn Harper, who neither smiled nor stepped forward, but simply stood where she had always stood, steady, prepared, and finally seen, without having asked to be noticed. For a fraction of a second after her name settled over the ballroom, there was no sound at all, as if the air itself had been instructed to hold. Then the whispers returned, not sharp, but stunned, moving in widening circles from the stage to the edges of the room, and every pair of eyes that had once slid past Evelyn now fixed on her with unmistakable focus. Daniel did not turn immediately, as though refusing to acknowledge what he had heard might undo it, but the tightening of his jaw betrayed him, and the glass in his hand lowered slowly until it hovered uncertainly at his side. His new wife blinked twice, her practiced smile dissolving into confusion, and she looked from the attorney to Daniel, as if waiting for clarification that did not arrive. The attorney continued reading, outlining the transfer of controlling interest, the authority to appoint and remove board members, the stewardship of charitable foundations and long-term investments, each detail reinforcing what the single sentence had already made clear. Evelyn felt the weight of the moment without being crushed by it, because she had carried it privately for weeks, had folded the knowledge into her daily routine of morning coffee and evening silence, had chosen not to announce it to anyone, not even to defend herself when rumors reached her about Daniel's growing influence within the company. She stepped forward only when the attorney inclined his head respectfully in her direction, not summoning but acknowledging, and the soft sound of her heels against marble seemed louder than the earlier applause for Daniel's speech. She did not rush, did not hesitate, crossing the distance with the calm of someone who understood that authority does not need to hurry. Daniel finally faced her fully now, disbelief struggling to maintain composure across his features, and in his eyes she saw calculation replacing certainty, the swift mental reordering of a future that no longer aligned with his expectations. Evelyn met his gaze without triumph, without accusation, simply with recognition, as though they were two professionals standing on opposite sides of a contract. She extended her hand toward the attorney, accepting the leather folder he offered, her fingers steady as they closed around it. and the simple act carried more weight than any raised voice could have. Around them, executives shifted their posture, subtle but undeniable, the angle of respect adjusting in real time. Daniel's shoulders lowered almost imperceptibly, the confidence that had framed him earlier thinning under the clarity of documented fact. Evelyn did not speak immediately, allowing the silence to breathe, allowing the reality to settle into every corner of the chandelier-lit room. And when she finally inclined her head in acknowledgement of the board, it was not a gesture of conquest, but of responsibility. She had not come to reclaim attention. She had come to accept duty, and in that distinction lay the quiet power that no one in the room had anticipated. The applause began hesitantly, scattered and uncertain, as though the room needed permission to accept what had just been declared, and then it gathered strength, not enthusiastic but respectful, a recognition of authority rather than celebration. Evelyn did not bow her head in gratitude, nor did she lift her chin in victory. She simply turned slightly toward the board members seated near the front and acknowledged them with a composed nod, the leather folder resting lightly against her palm as if it weighed no more than a simple notebook. Daniel remained where he stood, the careful architecture of his confidence quietly dismantling itself behind his eyes, and for the first time that evening he looked at her directly without pretense, without dismissal, searching her expression for something that would make sense of the reversal. She offered him nothing sharp, nothing triumphant, only calm. The attorney stepped aside, yielding space at the podium, and though no one formally invited her to speak, the shift in posture across the room created an opening that belonged to her alone. She walked toward the stage with measured steps, each heel striking the marble floor in steady rhythm, and as she ascended the low platform, she noticed how the chandeliers reflected differently from this height, how the room appeared smaller when viewed from responsibility rather than ambition. She placed the folder on the podium without opening it, resting her fingertips briefly against the polished wood that still carried the faint scent of varnish. When she spoke, her voice was even, neither raised nor timid, and she thanked the board for their continued dedication to the employees whose work sustained the company day after day, men and women who relied on stability more than spectacle. She did not mention Daniel, did not reference the surprise that still rippled quietly through the crowd, and she did not recount her history within the company. Instead, she spoke about continuity, about protecting long-term investments, about honoring the trust that had been placed in her hands. As she outlined her intention to meet individually with each department head within the next 30 days, to review current initiatives and assess community partnerships, the executives exchanged new glances, recalibrating their understanding of her not as an interruption but as a leader. Daniel listened in silence, the future he had imagined adjusting itself line by line with every word she delivered. When she concluded, she did not seek applause, and what followed was not thunderous but steady, a sound of acceptance rather than astonishment. Stepping down from the stage, she paused only briefly as Daniel approached, his expression composed yet altered, and though he opened his mouth as if to speak, no immediate words formed. Evelyn met his gaze once more, not to challenge him, but to acknowledge that the landscape between them had shifted, and in that quiet exchange there was no bitterness, only the unmistakable clarity of consequence. Daniel found his voice only after the applause dissolved into layered conversations, and he stepped into her path with a composure that felt recently assembled, his shoulders squared yet no longer certain. Up close, the distance of the past 8 years felt both immediate and impossibly far, measured not in miles but in decisions. He offered a restrained smile that did not quite reach his eyes and congratulated her in a tone calibrated for nearby listeners, careful, professional, as though they were colleagues meeting at a quarterly review rather than former partners whose history had once included shared rent checks and Sunday morning coffee. Evelyn listened without interruption, the leather folder resting against her side, her expression attentive but unreadable. When he mentioned that he had not known about the amendment, that he would have supported her if he had understood Charles Whitmore's intentions, she did not challenge the revision of memory. She simply allowed the words to pass, understanding that explanations often arrive too late to alter outcomes. His new wife hovered a few steps behind him, posture elegant but uncertain, eyes moving between them with restrained curiosity. Around them, executives shifted alliances in real time, some approaching Evelyn with measured warmth, others observing Daniel as if recalculating their proximity to influence. The quartet resumed playing softly, the music threading through the tension like a reminder that the evening was meant to celebrate continuity, not fracture. Daniel lowered his voice slightly and spoke about future collaboration, about how his experience within the company could still be an asset, and for a brief moment the old cadence returned, the persuasive rhythm he had once used across their kitchen table when pitching new opportunities. Evelyn met his gaze steadily and responded with the same calm tone she had used at the podium, acknowledging his contributions and assuring him that all roles would be evaluated with fairness and transparency in the coming weeks. She did not promise retention, did not threaten removal. She simply framed the process as inevitable and impartial. A flicker of recognition crossed his face then, the realization that their positions had shifted not emotionally but structurally, that authority now flowed through her signature rather than his introductions. A board member approached, requesting a brief word about scheduling the first strategic meeting under her leadership, and Daniel stepped aside instinctively, the choreography of power adjusting without instruction. Evelyn turned toward the board member, discussing timelines within the next 30 days, referencing reports she intended to review personally, her voice steady and specific. When she finally glanced back, Daniel was no longer directly in front of her, but standing slightly to the side, as if the architecture of the room itself had redrawn his place. She offered him a final nod, not dismissive but complete, and continued forward into conversations about budgets, community outreach, and long-term growth, leaving behind not a scene, not a confrontation, but a quiet reordering that required no raised voice to be understood. The evening did not fracture after the announcement. It reorganized itself, conversations tightening into smaller circles where strategy replaced speculation, and Evelyn moved through them with composed intention, listening more than she spoke, absorbing names, timelines, and commitments that would now require her signature. The chandeliers still shimmered overhead, but the room felt different from this vantage point, less like a stage, and more like a responsibility unfolding in real time. She discussed quarterly projections with the chief financial officer, asked measured questions about employee retention rates across regional offices, and made a quiet note to review the community scholarship program that Charles Whitmore had valued deeply. Each exchange reinforced what the documents had already declared, that stewardship was not ceremonial. It was operational. Across the ballroom, Daniel remained engaged in conversation, but the tone around him had shifted, less deferential, more cautious, and he glanced toward Evelyn more than once, not seeking approval, but recalibrating his understanding of the structure he now stood within. His new wife maintained her composure with admirable discipline, though her smile appeared less assured, as if she too sensed the subtle rearrangement of influence. When a senior board member asked Evelyn about her vision for expansion into renewable infrastructure, she answered without theatrics, outlining a phased approach over the next 18 months, emphasizing stability before scale, continuity before visibility. There was no triumph in her delivery, only clarity. She felt no impulse to address Daniel again, no need to revisit what had already been redefined by ink and witness. Instead, she allowed the evening to progress naturally, accepting congratulations with restrained gratitude and declining excessive praise with equal calm. As the string quartet shifted into a slower melody, she stepped briefly toward a window overlooking the city, lights stretching for miles into the night. And for a moment she allowed herself to feel the quiet weight of what had changed, not because she had been underestimated, but because she had endured without demanding recognition. When she turned back toward the room, she did not search for Daniel. She searched for the future awaiting her direction. And in that deliberate choice lay the final confirmation that this was not a victory over someone, but a commitment to something far greater. By the time the evening began to thin and guests drifted toward the exits, the energy in the ballroom had settled into something quieter, more deliberate, and Evelyn remained near the center of it without appearing to claim it. She concluded a final conversation with the chief operations officer, confirming a breakfast meeting at 8 o'clock the following Monday, then accepted a brief handshake from a regional director who had once overlooked her input during quarterly reviews. The air carried the fading notes of the quartet, and the soft clink of glassware being cleared, and beyond the tall windows the city lights stretched across the dark like a steady constellation. Daniel approached her one last time. Not hurried, not theatrical, simply measured, and when he stopped a respectful distance away there was no audience pressing close enough to turn it into spectacle. He spoke in a lower tone now, acknowledging that he had misjudged the direction of things, that he had assumed proximity to power was the same as possession of it. And though his words were careful, they carried an unfamiliar humility. Evelyn listened without interruption, her posture relaxed, her hands loosely clasped in front of her, and when he finished she answered with clarity rather than emotion, telling him that the company would move forward with structure and fairness, that every role would be evaluated on merit and alignment with long-term goals. She did not revisit the past, did not recite old grievances, because the shift between them no longer required explanation. Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing the reality that his future in the organization would depend not on history but on performance. And in that quiet understanding there was no hostility, only consequence. As he stepped back, yielding space without being asked, Evelyn felt neither vindication nor sorrow, only a steady awareness of responsibility. She glanced once more across the ballroom that had earlier treated her as an afterthought and now watched her with measured respect, and she understood that recognition had not arrived because she demanded it, but because she had become undeniable. When she finally moved toward the exit, the leather folder tucked securely at her side, her reflection followed her along the polished marble floor, composed and unhurried. She did not look back to see who was watching, because she no longer needed to confirm it. She had not reclaimed a person, she had claimed her place, and as the doors opened to the cool night air, she stepped forward into a future defined not by being ignored, but by being entrusted. The night air outside the Whitmore Grand Hotel felt cooler than it had hours earlier, carrying the faint scent of rain and distant traffic as Evelyn descended the stone steps with measured calm. The city stretching before her in steady lines of light and glass. A black sedan waited at the curb, engine idling softly, but she did not enter immediately, instead pausing for a brief moment beneath the hotel's canopy as guests filtered out behind her in clusters of subdued conversation. Inside those walls, her name had shifted the architecture of power, but out here the world remained indifferent. Taxis moved, signals changed, and somewhere a siren echoed faintly several blocks away. She welcomed that normalcy. Responsibility did not feel dramatic. It felt precise. Earlier that evening she had stepped into a role documented in ink, but now she began to consider what that role required beyond a ballroom announcement. She mentally outlined the next 90 days, reviewing financial audits, meeting with department heads, visiting the manufacturing facility in Ohio that employed over 300 workers whose livelihoods depended on decisions made in executive offices. She thought of Charles Whitmore's steady voice asking what she would protect first if everything else fell apart, and she answered again silently. Stability, dignity, continuity. Behind her, the revolving doors turned once more and Daniel emerged onto the sidewalk, pausing when he saw her still there. The distance between them was no longer defined by resentment, but by reality. He approached with restrained composure and offered a brief acknowledgement of her upcoming leadership, mentioning that he would forward detailed reports on his current projects by the end of the week. She nodded, thanking him in a tone that was courteous yet unmistakably professional, and there was no trace of the past in her delivery, only structure. A subtle understanding passed between them that whatever history they shared would not interfere with the company's direction. When he stepped back, adjusting his coat against the chill, she sensed that he finally recognized the permanence of what had changed. She opened the car door then, sliding into the quiet interior. The leather seat cooled beneath her hand, and as the sedan pulled away from the curb she did not look back at the hotel facade glowing against the night. She watched the city instead, the long avenues and steady traffic lights, aware that the true measure of leadership would begin not with applause but with action. In the reflection of the window, she saw her own composed expression and understood that this was not an ending scene, but the first page of something she would now write herself. The sedan carried her through avenues still glowing with late evening traffic, and by the time Evelyn reached her townhouse in Connecticut the clock on the dashboard read 11:47 p.m., a quiet hour when decisions felt heavier and clearer at the same time. She thanked the driver, stepped onto the familiar stone walkway, and unlocked the door to a home that had witnessed her rebuilding in silence. Inside, the lights responded softly, illuminating a space that was orderly but unadorned. No grand chandeliers, no waiting audience, only the steady hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of a wall clock. She placed the leather folder on the dining table where weeks earlier she had opened the letter that changed everything. And for a moment she simply stood there, palms resting against the wood, allowing the magnitude of the evening to settle without spectacle. The empire now attached to her name was measured in billions of dollars, in international contracts, in factories and offices across multiple states. But here the air smelled faintly of coffee grounds and clean linen, grounding her in something smaller and steadier. She removed her heels and walked to the kitchen, pouring a glass of water, the cool clarity of it welcome after hours of conversation. There were emails already waiting on her phone, notifications from board members and department heads, and one message from the chief financial officer confirming an early morning briefing packet would be delivered by 7 a.m. She did not open them yet. Instead, she stepped toward the window overlooking the quiet street, where a single porch light glowed across the way and a neighbor's car was parked in the driveway as it had been every night for years. Earlier that evening, Daniel had stood beneath crystal light recalculating his future, but here there was no audience to witness her transition, no applause to echo. She understood that leadership would not be proven in ballrooms, but in boardrooms at 8 a.m., in careful reviews of budgets, in decisions that protected employees whose names she did not yet know. She returned to the table and opened the folder again, scanning the formal language that transferred authority entirely into her hands, and she felt neither intimidation nor exhilaration, only clarity. She had not been chosen for charm or proximity. She had been chosen for steadiness. As midnight approached, she closed the folder, set her alarm for 6 a.m., and prepared for rest, aware that tomorrow would begin not with recognition, but with responsibility. And that was exactly how she intended to lead. At 6 a.m. the next morning, the alarm sounded softly in the quiet Connecticut townhouse, and Evelyn opened her eyes without hesitation, the weight of the previous night already organized into purpose rather than emotion. Pale winter light filtered through the curtains as she rose, moving through her routine with unhurried precision, brewing coffee, reviewing the briefing packet that had arrived electronically at 7 a.m., scanning revenue summaries, debt ratios, long-term contracts, scheduled for renewal within the next 12 months. Outside, the neighborhood stirred gently, a delivery truck passing, a neighbor walking a dog along the sidewalk, ordinary rhythms continuing without awareness that leadership of a billion-dollar enterprise had shifted overnight. By 8:30 a.m. she was seated at the head of a long conference table in the primary corporate office, the skyline visible through expansive windows. Department heads arranged around her with notepads open and expressions attentive. Daniel sat 3 seats to her right, composed and professional, a detailed report placed neatly before him. There was no lingering tension in the room, only expectation. Evelyn began the meeting not with ceremony, but with structure, outlining immediate priorities for the first 90 days, emphasizing operational stability, transparent communication, and accountability across all divisions. When Daniel presented his current projects, she listened carefully, asking specific questions about projected returns and risk exposure, her tone even and analytical. There was no trace of personal history in her evaluation, only clarity. The discussion moved forward efficiently, decisions documented, timelines assigned. As the meeting concluded, executives gathered their materials with renewed focus, aware that direction had shifted but confidence remained intact. Daniel paused briefly before leaving, offering a concise acknowledgement of her leadership, and she returned it with the same professional steadiness, the past fully separated from the present. Once the room emptied, Evelyn remained seated for a moment, looking out at the city that stretched for miles under a clear morning sky. She understood that influence did not announce itself with volume. It revealed itself through consistency. The applause from the ballroom had faded, the whispers had dissolved, but the work had begun. She rose, straightened the papers before her, and stepped into the hallway where employees moved with quiet purpose. And in that steady flow of motion, she recognized the true measure of what she had gained. She had not reclaimed what was lost. She had built what could not be ignored, and she walked forward knowing that dignity does not need to shout. It simply continues, unwavering and luminous.